Welcome to our second live streaming. We're going to be discussing a few topics today that have been kind of a theme on the PECS User Support Group Facebook page. And we're going to start off with talking specifically about the evidence for the use of speech generating devices with kids on the autism spectrum. One of the things I hear when I do trainings or when I'm in classrooms is we're taking the PECS book away and we're putting this child on a speech generating device because speech generating devices are better than PECS. When I hear phrases like that, what I want to know, first of all, is what's the evidence that speech generating devices as a whole are better than a PECS book? We do know that PECS is an evidence-based protocol, and it's evidence-based when the protocol is used appropriately. So my concern when people transition children from PECS to a speech-generating device, or just take the PECS book away and give the child a speech-generating device, is mainly, is the child going to lose his functional communication skills? So Andy's going to talk a little bit about some of the evidence.
Well, this question about looking at speech-generating devices has been around for a while because the technology, yes, it used to be clunkier, it used to be more expensive, but people have been looking at using devices for 30 or 40 years. A while ago, 10 years ago in 2007, a group took a look at the research at that point, and we're looking at picture exchange versus voice output communication aids, VOCAs. And one of the problems in doing a review even 10 years ago was many of the studies that involved picture exchange did not follow the PECS protocol. And the problem when people are looking at using picture exchange as a modality and not the protocol specifically is there's very little evidence that these various modifications and variations lead to faster acquisition. There's actually no one who has published a study showing a variation of the protocol that's associated with PECS produces faster acquisition or better discrimination or anything else. That is not to say that some of the discrimination strategies that we'll talk about a little bit later cannot be refined because the protocol is not specific to one discrimination strategy. But part of the protocol involves the sequence, teaching the picture exchange without involving discrimination, trying to use two people to avoid prompt dependency. So many of those features are not involved when people are comparing devices to what's called picture exchange instead of PECS per se. The other issue was when the authors at that time were quite happy that there were very few failures in the literature for either PECS or using devices. But one of the major concerns was how complicated were the communication repertoires. That is, when you're working with a student, especially when they're very young, 2, 3, 4 years old, what we're hoping for is not just functional communication, but a functional communication repertoire that is robust. There are lots of words, there are long sentences, there are requests and comments and attributes. It's a rich communication outcome is what we're looking for. At that time, almost 20 articles that dealt with SGDs, the range of the pictures on the devices was from 1 to 8. 1 to 8 pictures. All the studies focused on requested because at that point there was virtually no study that systematically showed commenting or anything else in the literature. Again, I'm not saying that even 10 years ago no one had ever successfully learned those skills with a device. What I'm saying is that if you review the literature, especially in the field of autism, we seem to have froze. There were no studies showing large communication repertoires for kids using devices. In more recent reviews, one that was done in 2014, I think, and one that was just published this past year, the same has been true, that there are more studies using devices, and people are occasionally trying to show that, well, you can teach multiple picture sentence structure. But again, the total number of pictures in those studies remains remarkably small. So what essentially we're all still looking for is, excuse me, a publication with a large proportion of children with autism who acquire a large repertoire with an SGD. And if anyone knows of such a study, please send it to me, because I'd love to read it. I've been asking people for studies like that. So that's one of the problems. In a more recent review, I think just last year, in an article by Gilmore, McCleary, and Leader, they essentially said very few people have demonstrated with SGDs the full range of the PECS protocol. That is, there are very few studies showing commenting or attributes. So this is a current review. So the field in the last 10 years, although there are more studies, there aren't really more studies showing that expansion of communication repertoires. Periodically, there was one study done a few years ago from a team that's trying to take a look at comparing SGDs and picture exchange and sign language. And they were used a group of students that they followed in several studies. And one of the studies tried to take a look at multiple picture use and social aspects of communication, hello, goodbye, thank you, etc. Problem was the study began with students who had acquired 15 pictures. So they had a device in which there were 15 total individual pictures. So again, what I'd like you to do is imagine a typical child who has 15 words. That is it, 15 words. Most children who have 15 words don't have sentence structure. They have 15 words. How am I doing, speech pathologist?
Good.
Good, okay. So imagine that child, a year and a half, something, depending on development, but just 15 words. And now I go away and I come back a few days later and I say, oh, now the child can say, hi, Grandpa, I want a cookie. Thank you. Bye-bye. If I said that a week later or 2 weeks later, you would just stare at me and say, that didn't happen. And yet this is published. There are people trying to say, look at all this expansive language, and yet there is no demonstration that individual pictures were highly discriminated. Each word, each picture has to have a contrast picture to have meaning. If I can say, I want toy, toy only has meaning if it's sometimes toy, sometimes drink, sometimes bowl. I want versus I see. I have versus mommy has. Please versus situations when I don't use the word. Bye-bye versus hi. And in the study, none of the pictures were shown to have that type of discriminative control. So sure, can I teach a child to push a button and the button says something interesting that I seem to understand as a skilled listener? Sure. Does it mean the child has learned to communicate in those various complicated ways? That's yet to be demonstrated. So, again, I think when you read the literature, you have to have a good understanding of typical language development, and you have to have essentially to expect more of a child who's having trouble learning language than what we would of a typical child. I think that's when you have to kind of go, what's going on? So all in all, again, the research, if you will, is encouraging. I have no doubt that there are children with autism who use devices in complicated ways, but it's not in the literature as far as I know. So that's what we need. We need to have better research to support that this is good.
So one of the frequent comments and questions we see on this Facebook page is questions related to this. My student, my child is using PECS, and we're now taking it away and giving him a device because devices are evidence-based. What's your advice to people who hear that? What can they say to the people who are saying we're switching to devices because they're evidence-based?
Well, the problem, one of the problems is the phrase evidence-based. What does it mean? If somebody has a single publication on something, it doesn't mean what they published. That strategy, that technique is now evidence-based. It takes a substantial, number of studies with a large number of children, and essentially replication by people who probably should have nothing to do with the strategy from the first place. That is, if all the research on PECS were studies that only Lori and Andy did, then all of you should rightly question it. But PECS is viewed as evidence-based because there are many studies from around the world by people that we literally have nothing to do with. That's what leads people to conclude that things are evidence-based. In the 2012 study in pediatrics on non-medical interventions in autism, they cite the support for PECS and applied behavior analysis. But they also point out that at that point, there were no studies showing SGDs were effective intervention strategies at that point. Again, times change. There may be more studies out there. But that's part of the issue. One of the comparisons that people are making is sometimes they'll take a device and compare it to what they call a picture exchange or PECS per se. And they'll say, well, they're equivalent, so we should just use the device. But if you look carefully at the graphs and the rate of acquisition of phase one, just the initial exchange, what I've seen in several studies is very slow rates of acquisition. And
in what condition?
In the PECS condition or the picture exchange condition, and very slow rates of acquisition in the SGD condition. Meaning you're looking at slow versus slow and say, well, they're just as good. Well, what we've seen in many publications on PECS is that when the protocol is followed, phase one acquisition is rapid. So if you're not seeing that in the study, and somebody's saying they're doing a modified protocol for picture exchange, then what have we learned when two things are not very good? I'm not sure, that we really are learning something that's going to be helpful for the next child, other than, well, maybe we shouldn't do either one of these because they both lead to very slow outcomes.
Okay. Anything else to add to that discussion?
Not for me.
Okay. I don't want anybody to leave this discussion with the idea that we are saying don't transition your kids to speech generating devices. I have supervised cases, many now, where we've successfully transitioned children from PECS to a speech generating device. We teach a full day workshop on how to do the transition from PECS to a speech generating device. What would you say to the people, though, who say, but my child prefers an iPad over his PECS book?
Well, the issue of preference it's an interesting question. Number one, well, of course he'll like an iPad more than he'll like a PECS book. PECS book's pretty boring. There are a lot of cool things on an iPad. I think there are relatively few children in the world who probably have not experienced the joys of playing with an iPad, and probably before they've been introduced to a communication app on the iPad. So you have, a source of many different reinforcers, not just in a communication app. The other issue is, while I might find a child's preference interesting, how much weight do I give it when I'm trying to make clinical decisions? And one of the analogies, that I've used in the past is, imagine my 5-year-old, grandson wants to learn to ride a bicycle. And so I go, okay, well, let me assess his preference. And I show him a picture of a tricycle, and he kind of looks at it. And I show him a picture of a bicycle with 2 wheels, and he looks a little bit more. And now I show him a picture of a Harley motorcycle, and he goes, oh, that's the one that I want. Would I now go out and say, oh, well, that's your preference, so I'm going to start teaching you to ride a Harley? I probably get in a lot of trouble if I tried that. There still is a sequence. I know that's what you want to do, and we will try to get you the skills to get there one day in a safe manner. Now, with a device, I'm not saying it's literally dangerous to use a device, but again, the research doesn't show it's more effective. In fact, one study by Hill tried to take a look at children who had no PECS experience versus some that had some PECS experience and transitioning them to the device. And what they found was only the children who had PECS experience through discrimination and starting into sentence structure actually made the transition. The other children did not. And again, that it's that type of research that we have to take a look at.
To wrap up this quick discussion too, if you go to our website, PECS.com, you can download our position statement on transitioning from PECS to a speech generating device. And we keep using the word transition because what we have found is that kids who are using PECS successfully have the foundational communication skills. And when they have those mastered, we find the transition is a lot easier. Because if you think about what's required for a student to use a device, the student's required to learn how to communicate with the device, and he has to learn how to essentially run the device, what we might call navigate within the device. And what we're finding is it's an easier transition when we have kids who already have the foundation communication skills with PECS. Once we then transition them to the device, the new skills that they're learning are those navigation skills for the device.
So I'm going to go a little bit out of our sequence because I see a question from Croatia. So hello. There's a question about working with a child that seems to only respond well to food, and should they use PECS?
Just by the way, food is probably my ultimate reinforcer.
Yeah, I mean, give me chocolate, I'll work really hard too. So, we don't want to limit the occasions of PECS to food. There are, unfortunately, we see sometimes programs where they take the PECS board out at snack time and at lunchtime, and otherwise it's away. And I call that the edible exchange communication system, and that's a bad idea. But if a child does not have a broad range of reinforcers, things other than food, then our job is to find those other interesting things. What do you like to put together? What do you like to listen to? What do you like to feel? We need to be more creative to figure out what else the child likes. The other issue is most of the time we see people do things that I would call, they're a little bit boring. Like I hold 2 toys in front of Lori and they're just doing nothing, and she's just not reacting. On the other hand, if I start spinning something and it's already doing something, and now I stop it and she reaches for it, oh, so when I interrupted something, that got more motivation going. So don't just offer things that are just lying there in neutral state for example. Get kids involved in an activity and interrupt it, start and stop things, turn the TV or the music off and see what happens then. You'll often be able to find many more types of reinforcers in those types of situations.
Good job.
Is there another question?
What do we do with when we're working in schools that have already been provided with iPads, and for that reason alone we'll use them as the student's communication method? Go ahead. That's a loaded question, a hot topic. And sometimes it's the school that's provided the iPad. Sometimes I see kids getting off the bus with an iPad in their book bag with a note from home saying, please now use this for his communication.
Right. We've also been in schools where the school board has bought an iPad or a smart tablet for every student, so everybody feels, well, since we have it, we have to use it. Again, you know, I think the issue is we have to answer questions that are focused on individual children. I don't try to work with autism. I'm not working with a child's disability. I'm working with Johnny and Mary and Billy. And if I'm not quite sure what to do, I'm going to ask them what's good for you. So there are times when I might say, well, okay, so if he's using PECS, what does he do? If he's using, you know, the smart tablet, what does he do? And use the child's performance to help guide what we're going to do. To simply use technology because it's available is a mistake. Okay, technology doesn't solve anything. What's more important than the technology that's available is the science of teaching. Am I using the science of teaching associated with devices? Exposure simply doesn't work. Putting these devices and cool technology in front of kids, it doesn't help. There's no evidence that it helps. So what I'm always going to do is very politely try to figure out, okay, what is it we expect the child to do? Can we be very explicit about that? And then can we test under what conditions does that performance happen? As Catherine is pointing out too online, that, you know, there are a lot more discussions on our website about PECS to SGD transitioning. So, you know, we hope everybody will take a look at that if you haven't before.
Okay, switching gears to a slightly different topic. We've seen several questions over the past several months about a student who during a very structured activity is doing well with PECS. And as soon as we try and generalize away from the training table, the student tends to fall apart. For those of you who have access to the PECS manual, in the manual, each phase is described in its own chapter, and in each chapter there's a description of the structured training environment and then what we call the relaxed training environment. And I think the structured training environment is easy. It's easy for us to set up. It's easy for me to isolate a couple of preferred items on a table, have a clean table, no distractions on it, my two trainers available, and the student. Capture his attention because I have this wonderfully exciting reinforcer available. And that training, if we've identified that powerful reinforcer and we're prompting correctly, phase one mastery is usually relatively quick. And for those of you who've been to our PECS level 1 training, actually many of our different trainings, you've probably seen our famous video of dancing Layla and the Dancing Ladies. That's an example of really, really fast acquisition of phase 1 of PECS within about 5 trials. What I find can be difficult and challenging for some people is moving away from that training table. And it could be for a couple of reasons. It could be because really what we do all day is sit at the table and do structured activities. And that's generally how our classrooms, our home programs, or our clinic-based programs are organized. And it's a challenge just to move away from the table, let alone to move away from the table and then teach. So one of the questions was about a student who at the training table does fine with PECS, but might tire of a particular activity or a particular reinforcer. Quick answer to that one is there's no rule that says you can't change up reinforcers from trial to trial when you're doing that structured training. But also, when the child leaves the training table, kind of wanders around and picks up something, so you try and jump in to do a quick PECS trial, but the child loses interest in it. I think we also have to be really aware of what our relaxed environment looks like. Many places, the relaxed environment means anything I could possibly dream of is available and free. So my perfect relaxed environment would be a room full of chocolate and Diet Coke, and that's all that's available. And Andy. And I don't have to ask for any of it. It's always freely available. So one of the keys to capitalizing on the non-structured or the relaxed training environment is to structure your training environment, your relaxed training environment. So things need to be up out of reach but in sight. Things need to not just be free. And remember, kids aren't going to be interested in something that they've just played with for an hour. They might be bored with it at that point in time. So when you're moving away from the training table into the relaxed training environment, keep aware that you have to have organized that relaxed training environment before you do this moving away from the structured table. And then what I try to do is maybe do an activity that is kind of what I call semi-structured. So we're in the play area, but the play area is cleaned out of all potential toys, and I have your 3 or 4 favorite things on the floor between us. We've done PECS in the sandbox. That's a great place because you kind of have captive kids because they love being in the sandbox. So when we talk about the relaxed training environment, we don't mean just turn the kids loose in the classroom or in the home and see if they're going to come ask you for something. You have to sabotage the environment, organize the environment, and then create expectations that the student or your child will communicate. In the PECS manual, we also talk about a strategy that many, many years ago I dubbed stop, drop, and talk therapy. And this was when I was team teaching with a special ed teacher in a public school program. And during playtime, the teacher and I kind of struggled with, her goal for playtime was the kids should learn to play with toys appropriately. My goal during playtime was these kids should learn to ask for things that they want to play with. So we kind of went back and forth with that. So we would sit a child down, start teaching him how to play with the toy. Once he was obviously enjoying playing with the toy, we would then interrupt the toy play. So we would stop, drop to the floor on his level, and create one requesting opportunity for PECS. So many of those relaxed opportunities are going to be interspersed across an activity or interspersed across the entire day. Anything to add to that?
I think one of my sort of views on teaching is, why teaching is difficult is a good teacher is someone who is organized and does things systematically. But the danger is if you push that, you become ritualistic. And the problem with being ritualistic, I have to do it the same way every single time, is that rituals are when you are insensitive to what's going on around the world. And if you have a ritual and you teach your children to respond to the ritual, then they have more rituals. And well, what's one of the problems in autism? They have rituals. So my view is, keep your ritual to yourself. He's got his, you've got yours, and he doesn't need to use yours. So how can we be, as Lori is saying, systematic? Again, part of the problem, I think, is people start to isolate lessons. This is the requesting lesson, we're done. This is the receptive identification lesson, we're done. This is the imitation lesson, we're done. And that's a big problem because the kids, they start to see those patterns. We had a teacher setting up lessons where the same materials were always used for the color lesson. So she would stop whatever lesson she was doing. She would see her book, oh, color lesson. She would reach down for the bin with the color lesson materials. She'd put it on the table. And the child looked at her and went, blue, red, purple. Can we go now? Because he knew this is what we're going to talk about. That's not a good lesson. What we are trying to get people to recognize is that think of all the lessons associated with an activity. If there's a spinner, he can learn to play with it. That's one lesson. He can learn to take the spinner when I take the spinner versus take a cup when I take a cup. Different lesson. He can learn what I do with it, spinning it slowly, spinning it quickly. He can ask for it. He can comment about it. He can respond to take the spinner versus take the cup. All of those are available because the spinner's around. When you isolate things and say, no, this is the spinner lesson and requesting is a different lesson, that's when I think the teaching becomes, again, what I call ritualistic instead of systematic. So again, what we're advising is, yes, there are times when you want to really focus and be very structured so you can maximize the opportunities to learn, but then you have to take that lesson into the real environment. That's what Lori uses the term relaxed. So if I'm doing my color lesson, drilling on red and blue at the magic table, I got to leave the magic table. Not in 6 weeks. I got to leave the magic table and figure out where's red and blue showing up today. Those are the kind of lessons we're hoping everybody creates.
So I want to remind you too of the strategy Andy talked about where we get a child involved in an activity and then pause. Many times I've been on a playground with a group of children and the swings are there and they're empty and they're available, but none of my students will come and get me to take me to the swing or will bring me a picture and ask for the swing. But if I take the child over and put him on the swing and put him into the up position, that then creates the motivation for my student to ask for swing or ask for let me go. So that kind of interruption strategy is something that I find really, really helpful in the relaxed environment.
Yeah. And again, there's nothing wrong with what we might think of as warming up lessons. If we're going to go to the zoo, sure, before you go to the zoo, you might have conversations and activities related to the things you'll see at the zoo. Before you go shopping, what's the vocabulary that's likely to show up in the supermarket? So warming kids up in those kind of fashions, that's fine. But just to think that all the learning is going to happen at the magic table and somehow it's the child's job to generalize to the real world, that's not a good way to think about teaching.
Okie dokie. John, thanks for your comment. It's comments like yours where you said you kind of had that aha moment with your student who seemed to be struggling with phase 1 and then got it. Those kinds of comments are huge, huge, and they make me happy, make me want to continue to work. And hi, Soraya from Brazil. Yay. Okay, lots and lots of questions over the past few months about discrimination training. And first and foremost, when you have an issue with discrimination or your student is not acquiring picture discrimination as rapidly as you would like him to do, the first couple of recommendations we always make is look at yourself, look at your own training, how you're implementing the training. And when we question our consultants all over the world and we ask them what training mistakes do you see people making most frequently, at the top of the list are two things. One is not doing appropriate error correction. So we'll talk about the error correction for discrimination training. And the other is not using appropriate reinforcement strategies. So we'll also describe some of those. But what I want you to keep in mind too is that if you've identified that really powerful reinforcer, and you know that your student doesn't have any visual issues, so there's no cortical blindness or acuity issues, and I always call in a vision consultant to make sure that's not an issue. Then what we want to do is, first of all, get you to clean up your training, and then we can start talking about some alternatives to our what's usually our simple, relatively easy discrimination strategies. So, I mentioned using appropriate reinforcement strategies. So let's say Andy is my student, and this is a Phase 3A lesson. And remember, in Phase 3A, we start teaching the child to discriminate between a highly preferred item and a non-preferred item. Because at this point in time, the consequences then are going to be what motivate Andy. You give me the picture of ball, you get your favorite ball. Yay! You give me a picture of, whoops, paperclip. You get a paperclip, and it's no fun, and you don't like it. So what now can happen is I can capitalize on a couple of the strategies we mentioned to make sure that my training is going to be much more likely to end in Andy independently discriminating between pictures. So the first strategy, or the first teaching strategy that I want you to make sure you're doing appropriately is remember to reinforce within a half second the new behavior. And in phase 3A, the new behavior is not giving a picture. We mastered that. We don't have to reinforce that one as quickly or as frequently. The new behavior now is choosing between two pictures. So I have to be able to reinforce, provide some reinforcement the moment Andy chooses the correct picture. Now, how do you know the moment he's chosen the correct picture? Now? 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 Now. That's when he's chosen the correct picture. So the reinforcement has to be delivered the moment he touches the correct picture. I can start throwing the ball at him, but then he'll lose the exchange. So we're going to use some social reinforcement. I'm simply going to say, yeah, that's right, ball, here's your ball. So we call that reinforcing the new behavior. We call it using the half-second rule. The moment Andy's hand reaches for and commits to one picture versus the other is when we're going to start providing that social praise. And then once he's completed the exchange, he will then continue to get his reinforcing item.
So in behavioral terminology, what we're providing on the moment of contact is a conditioned reinforcer, meaning I need to have a history that that signal, that sound, that stimulus is already reinforcing. So we can't tell you what to say to the children you work with. You have to establish that yourself. We talk about other times when we want people to be grandma or grandpa. When I give over something, I'm like, here's a toy, and ooh, what do you have? So those sounds, ooh, and those are associated with good things are coming. Saying things like, good job, Lori, good job, Lori, good job, Lori. Well, in America, she'd fall asleep because she's heard that 10,000 times and it means nothing. So wherever you are around the world, I can't tell you what sound, what reaction you should have. You need to develop that in your relationship with your own student.
And Mickey, you asked about discrimination within attributes training. The same principles apply. First of all, I'm doing attribute training with attributes that are reinforcing from the child's perspective. Maybe Andy doesn't care what color of spinner he gets, so I'm not going to do colors within the context of the spinners. Maybe he does care about, my grandkids are much better at this than I am. Maybe he does care whether or not we spin it slow or we spin it fast. If that matters to him, then I might work on slow versus fast to start with. So once you've chosen the attribute that's reinforcing, the same principles apply. The moment he reaches for the fast picture, that's when you reinforce within a half second. If he gives you slow but wants fast, then you're going to use the error correction strategy that Andy's about to demonstrate.
I'll still be your student. Let's just keep
I'm going to demonstrate it. Okay, so I have my paper clip. I have my ball. These are the items that Andy wants. We're going to try and keep the book oriented to where you all can see it, but normally it's facing Andy, so he can see all the pictures. I have to be able to see the moment he reaches for the correct picture so I can provide that reinforcement. In English, we say, ooh, the new. Oh, ball. Very good, Andy. Good job. And remember, in PECS, we teach picture discrimination, not location discrimination. So I move the pictures around after a successful exchange. Gave me the paper clip. I'm going to give him the paper clip, and this is only going to work if he rejects it. So he's obviously rejecting it. Remember, the 4-step error correction procedure involves 4 steps. So I'm going to put the picture back where it was. First thing I'm going to do is model or show him the correct picture. I'm going to do whatever it takes to get him to look at the correct picture. tapping it sometimes is sufficient. Then I want him to practice exchanging the correct picture. So I'll hold my hand out, he exchanges it. Does he get the ball yet? No, because I would be reinforcing a prompted response. So I'm going to put the picture back. I might give him a little bit of social praise. Yep, that's the ball. And then I want to essentially change Andy's focus right now. So I might turn the book over. If there are some quick directions he can respond to, I might give him one of those. Andy, touch your nose. Very good. And then I'm going to repeat by presenting both items again to him and waiting to see what he does. Wow, ball, very good. Okay, let's show it in real time, Andy. So after the end of that successful exchange, I'm moving the pictures around. Paper clip. Okay, he rejected. Model. Oops, model the correct picture though. Sorry. Ball. Model. Practice. Good job, Andy. Change the subject or delay or distract. Put the picture back and repeat. Ball. Very good. Should we do it right once?
It's good on the internet. You can erase things, right?
Okay, and I'm going to continue to move the pictures around between successful trial, after a successful trial.
Okay. So there are no perfect lessons. So there is no way I can promise I'm going to show you a lesson that will work for all the children all the time and everything. It doesn't exist. Anyone who promises that their next lesson will work, just laugh. Just have a good time, because you can't do it. No one can guarantee it. So we like to start here in part because there's an important teaching strategy for teachers to learn, the error correction. Now, it might work, maybe it doesn't. So we have to be prepared with alternatives, because, you know, one of my lines is the children don't read the literature. They don't know what they're supposed to do. You're supposed to take the picture now. They're always right. So for some children, this strategy isn't the best. For some children, I give Lori a paper clip and, ooh, she thinks it's just as much fun as the ball. So why would she learn to pay attention to ball or paper clips since she likes to play with both? So there are a lot of variations out there, and that's the beauty of the science of teaching. There are people who are constantly developing new discrimination strategies. And if it's an evidence-based discrimination strategy and you want to try it and you will take good data and show that it's effective with your student, that is within the protocol of PECS. If you're doing discrimination in the right sequence after we've worked on phase 1 and some generalization issues in phase 2. But what are some of the variations? Again, we think there are sometimes people are overthinking this. They're really concerned about the nature of the picture and what picture should I use in phase 1. And like, don't worry about it. My line is use the picture you have. Research supports that. There are no better pictures for phase 1. But now you might need to consider features of the picture itself. The simplest rule in picture discrimination is, I was once talking to a vision expert years ago about, you know, what are the things which universally seem to help. And after talking about lots of different strategies, it kind of turns out that, you know what helps? Big pictures far apart. So I'm showing you something silly here, meaning, oops, don't be constrained by the size of the book. A lot of people will only put the pictures on a book. Well, it could be at least that far away. And if you need to put the pictures even farther away, then do it. So a big picture is far apart helps discrimination. What's a way to guarantee you get a lot of errors? Little pictures close together, which is what you see a lot of people working on. So that's one of the first variations we would suggest, taking a look at it. Other people want to vary the content of the picture. And one of the biggest differences that we can kind of think about is, here's a picture of something you like, and this is a blank card. There is no picture on it. Can the child simply track where this is? It still has to move around the book. Now, by doing that, this is a type of prompt. A prompt is something we do to help children perform, and we get rid of prompts. So the moment this starts working, now the real work begins. Unfortunately, we see people leave the blank there for weeks and weeks and months, and that's not helping. Essentially, once you have figured out, okay, he's making good discriminations, this picture, the contents has to change. The blank has to become more picture-like, and there are many different strategies for doing that. Might you need to go to three-dimensional instead of black and white or colored line drawings? The answer is yes, but in our practical experience, the number has been relatively small. I mean,
in all my years of doing PECS, over 30 years now, I've done it with 2 kids.
Yeah, so I think Lori, probably has a lot of experience. So if you're convinced you've got 3 kids in your room that need, object discrimination before they start PECS, we're going to say it's unlikely. We would suggest use pictures, use good teaching strategies, then see what you need to do about variations. The other variation that I sometimes, will talk about is essentially when we do this, we're looking at a simultaneous discrimination. I've got to look at the 2. Well, another variation is take a textbook, have it empty, and teach the child to now flip through. It's not there. It's not there. It's not there. Well, there's the picture and hand it over. And again, the first round is simply find the picture in the book. Then what you might want to do is stick in possibly a blank. So he opens the book, there's nothing there, opens the book, skips that, keeps turning pages, finds the picture and hands it over. So we have found some kids essentially when they can do the single picture, is this the thing I want, as opposed to an immediate comparison, they seem to perform better. Of course, you can't leave it that way. You eventually have to move to simultaneous discrimination because that's the way the communication is going to look over time.
Can I pose a dilemma?
Sure.
Let's say I have a student who does this, and I am going to turn the book around so that I can see, but I want you guys to note my face in relationship to the pictures.
Okay, good job. So what happened there? We would say her fingers did the looking. And since I doubt she really has supernatural abilities, we would say that was luck. The problem is some children have been doing that in phases 1 and 2. There's a single picture. Lori looks any place, her fingers make contact and they give it over. So our first recommendation is if you see that, reach and look away in phases 1 or 2, don't let it work accidentally. Again, I simply block. I simply put my hand on the child's hand and not allow that to accidentally get reinforced.
And how would you teach me to look?
So then the issue is, well, if you think about the sequence we taught in phase 1, we usually talk about pick up, reach, and release. Actually, what precedes that is look, pick up, reach, and release. So we didn't write that in the book, the manual, but it's something that we assume. But again, some children don't read the manual, so they do make a mistake. So if I'm with Lori, if the book is flat on the table and I'm looking at Lori this way, I'm going to have trouble seeing where her eyes are. But if I hold the book up, now I can see where her eyes are. And as she's looking at me and her hand goes, I'm not going to let it work. But if her eyes go to the picture, now I put it close enough and she can exchange. So what we're teaching is for kids who have already learned give a picture and you'll get something you like. We're going to use the opportunity to take the picture to reinforce, look at the picture. There you go, very nice.
I sometimes call it target practice. So as Andy's reaching without looking, I'm moving the book around. There you go. And I'll stop moving once he starts looking for the picture.
One of the other things you might do is when children are having trouble with discrimination, sometimes I kind of say, if you will, to the child, how do you see the world? What are you seeing? We cannot assume that the way we see things is the way all children see things. And I don't mean in terms of disability or not. I mean literally what tends to go together. So if I have a child who's been drinking and I put a little bit of juice in and he finishes it and he clearly wants more juice, I might have on one side of the room a container of juice, and the other side there's a table with a pile of socks. And I might just see, where does he walk? If he takes his glass and walks over to where the juice is, then he sees that juice is different than socks. I know in one matter that sounds silly, but that's important to know. He has learned, go find juice bottles when you want juice. Okay, I might figure that out with other objects in the house, in the classroom, etc. Once I've seen that, perhaps I take a big picture and cover the juice. So there's a photograph or a picture of the juice behind which is the juice versus a photograph of the socks behind which are the socks. And again, once I've given him a little bit of juice, put him in the middle, see which way does he walk. If he sees the difference between the picture of juice and the picture of socks, again, that's very important information. So there are many ways we need to figure out, how do you see the world? The question earlier also about attributes, like how do I know Lori sees colors? Again, one of the most functional examples I learned about was in Lima, Peru years ago, where most of the children enjoyed eating bananas, but if you put a yellow banana in front of the child and a brown banana in front of the child, guess what? They never picked up the brown banana. So what did that tell us? He or she sees the difference. Now, knowing that color is important in this situation, then I can take advantage of that and build it into other lessons as well. So again, we need to be more clever in how we ask children how they respond to things that are already important. Looking at yellow piece of paper, starting this off with touch yellow, touch red, and go to sleep should all go together, because that's about as boring a lesson as you can create. And if the child could care less about the colored pieces of paper, or for some of the children, they're not thrilled that you're thrilled, so your praise, your happiness is like, so Lori's happy now, big deal. But if it's, I like orange juice and I cannot stand grape juice, and Lori's holding up 2 cups and I consistently take the orange juice, then Lori has figured out, oh, Andy sees the difference between orange and purple. And if you can figure it out in one situation, you can take advantage and start building it into others.
Now, relating this back to our discussion of the structured versus the relaxed training environment, when I'm doing new discrimination lessons, I tend to do that in my structured training environment because I want to be available to do the error correction and the half-second reinforcement.
Yep.
So my structured lesson is now over and we're heading off to something else. Hopefully, because Andy learned phase 2, as we're heading off to something else, he's going to be taking his book with him. So now is when I'm hoping for lots of incidental opportunities for requesting. The way I'm going to ensure that those opportunities are correct is by simplifying the task requirement. So I'll put the distractor picture back inside the book and sending Andy off with the book on his shoulder. knowing that his most desired item in the whole world is the picture of it is freely available on the front of the book. So we talk about the target lesson that I actively teach during my structured lessons, and my more relaxed lessons are opportunities to practice mastered skills. So my mastered skill, once I start phase 3A, is a single picture that's available to me. And that single picture is going to be what your student is most likely to want given what's available as he walks away from the structured table. Okay.
So again, if you're working on big and little, up and down, in and out, if you're doing that at your, your structured magic table time, you have to make sure some other time of that same day, you're creating opportunities for that same vocabulary. What's the mastery criteria for 3A? We essentially want from at least half a dozen to a dozen different pictures that are discriminated very well.
In arrays of 2.
Right, 2 at a time. So I want at least 6 to 12 pictures. I don't want to wait till I have 50 because that starts to develop rituals about how many pictures are going to be on the book. What's the criteria? We suggest 80%. A lot of people want to push 90%. I wouldn't argue with them. But you want a high level of discrimination over a certain number of days. That is my sort of the mastery level for my, if you will, the educational documentation. Within a single lesson, I might push more. I might see a child's making great progress, with some discrimination, and I might try a correspondence check just to see what happens, even though he hasn't mastered 85% for 3 days in a row on 6 different items. That's a probe. That's okay to do. A lot of times children have more skills than we think. And the only way you can figure that out is if you push a little bit and see what happens.
Okay, wrapping this up. I think today we hit 6,000 members.
Yes, 6,000
on this
members
Facebook
today, yeah.
group. So thanks to each and every one of you 6,000, even though I'm one of them. I will thank myself. Please continue posting your questions, your comments, your great stories. I love hearing about your successes. I love hearing about the problem solving you're doing and whether or not it worked. And we're going to continue doing this live streaming probably every couple of months. So if you have a topic to suggest for us, please let us know. We do have people who are tracking topic suggestions, and we'll try and be as responsive as we can to some of your requests. Okay?
Yep.
Good job.
Good job, Lori.
High five.
I'll find chocolate for you.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you in a couple of months.
Bye-bye.
Bye.